I first saw the daguerreotype on a rain-streaked afternoon in November, the kind of day when the campus seemed suspended between centuries. I had been hired by the university's Department of Visual Culture to catalogue a private donation. Several dozen Victorian photographs purchased from the estate of an eccentric antiquarian named Thomas Lyle. Most were unremarkable. Portraits of stoic men with mutton chops, women with severe middle parts, anonymous infants swaddled in lace. The kind of images that feel like they're watching you more than you're watching them. But one case caught my attention before I even opened it. A heavy, brass-framed daguerreotype, its glass faintly fogged with age, sealed in a leather case whose hinges had rusted to powder. A small tag tied with twine bore the handwritten note, "Unidentified couple, 1867. Inside was the photograph that would change everything. The couple stared from the silvered surface with that unblinking solemnity peculiar to the mid-Victorian age. The man, perhaps in his late 30s, had the thick sideburns and determined expression of a tradesman who had recently risen into gentility. His wife, or sister, it was hard to tell, sat stiffly beside him in a high-necked black dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. But what arrested me wasn't their faces. It was what they held between them. Each of them gripped one side of a small framed photograph within the image itself, as though presenting it to the camera. Inside that inner frame was a second photograph. Another family group, 5 people this time, 2 adults, 3 children, posed before a patterned backdrop. The detail was exquisite, though barely visible at first glance. I adjusted the light and magnified the scan on my monitor. And that was when I noticed it, something standing just behind the smaller group, at the very edge of the composition. A shape, too indistinct to name, too solid to ignore. I thought at first that it might be a trick of exposure, a shadow cast by the photographer perhaps, or a flaw in the plate. But the longer I looked, the less it resembled any artifact I'd seen in 2 decades of working with 19th century images. It wasn't smudged or diffused like chemical damage. It had edges, deliberate ones. Behind the seated woman in the inner photo, a darker shape loomed, vaguely human, slightly bent, its head at an unnatural angle. I could just make out what looked like the curve of a jaw, the glint of an eye. I leaned closer until my reflection merged with theirs in the screen. That's when I realized something even stranger. The direction of the couple's gaze in the outer photograph. They weren't looking at the camera. They were looking at the picture they were holding. At that moment, the building's old heating pipes groaned, one of those deep metallic sighs that seem to travel through the bones of a structure. Still, I remember feeling a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. I logged the daguerreotype as unidentified couple with secondary image, possible double exposure, and filed it for later analysis. But that night, I dreamed of it. The couple motionless in their sepia world, the smaller family inside their frame, frozen mid-breath, and behind them that shadow, leaning forward, patient as a thought you refuse to finish. Over the next week, I tried to trace the photograph's provenance. Lyle's estate papers were a labyrinth of half-legible receipts and handwritten ledgers. Finally, in a faded notebook dated 1978, I found an entry. Acquired daguerreotype, unknown origin. Said to have come from the estate of Dr. H. Alcott, formerly of Surrey. Gift from Miss V. Bior, who claimed her grandfather found it bricked up behind a mantel in 1923. Bricked up. I underlined the words twice. The Alcott name struck a chord. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I recalled a reference from a paper I'd read years before, something about a Dr. Henry Alcott, physician to a rural asylum in Kent during the 1860s. A quick search confirmed it. He had been known for his interest in photographic psychology, an early misguided attempt to capture mental illness through portraiture. My heart began to race. If the photograph came from Alcott's estate, It might not be a domestic portrait at all. It might be one of his experiments. I contacted the Surrey County Archives the next morning and requested Alcott's surviving papers. The archivist, a brisk woman named Mrs. Talbot, told me that most of his records had been destroyed in a flood decades earlier, but she mentioned something curious. "There is a surviving patient register," she said, "and a few photographs catalogued under restricted access. You'll need to visit in person." 2 days later, I took the early train south. The archive building sat behind an old hospital complex, its stonework the color of rain. Inside, the reading room was silent except for the turning of pages. Mrs. Talbot brought out a single leather-bound ledger and placed it before me like something sacred. The label read, "Brookhaven Asylum, 1865 to 1869. Halfway through the register, I found a name that made me sit back. Patient 47, Mrs. Eleanor A., age 29, admitted February 1867. Symptoms: visual disturbances, melancholia, fixation on photographic image. Claims her late husband speaks from the silver. Discharged. Deceased. June 1867. The entry ended with a small ink blot. I turned the page. Tucked between the leaves was a photograph, an original Daguerreotype plate protected by tissue. My pulse quickened as I recognized the ornate border, the distinctive brass mat. When I tilted it toward the light, the same couple stared back at me. Only this time, the image was different. The woman's eyes were closed, the man's were not. And the inner photograph they held, so crisp in the version I had, was faint, as though something within it had shifted during exposure. I took high-resolution scans of both versions that afternoon. Side by side, the differences were undeniable. In the newly discovered one, the shadow behind the inner family had moved closer, its outline clearer. Its head now aligned perfectly with the top of the frame, as though rising. That night, back at the university lab, I enlarged the digital image to its highest resolution. When the pixels resolved into clarity, my breath caught. The shadow wasn't amorphous anymore. It was a figure, tall, thin, its mouth open slightly as if speaking. And inside that darkness, I could see the faint outline of another face, half-formed, as though caught mid-emergence. I zoomed out quickly, heart pounding. Every instinct told me to close the file, to lock the daguerreotype back in storage and forget it existed. But curiosity, or something deeper, kept me rooted to the screen. I needed to know what Dr. Alcott had been doing. The next day, I combed through academic journals from the 1860s. One article in the Photographic Times and News of the World mentioned Alcott's name. The piece described his experiments in spirit photography, which he claimed were purely scientific. He believed trauma left vibrations in the chemical composition of air, which could be impressed upon silver plates. Most dismissed him as a charlatan. But the article ended with a disturbing anecdote. During one experiment in June 1867, a plate reportedly captured an image which none present had seen with their eyes, but which appeared clearly upon development. A figure behind the subject, described by all who viewed it as resembling the late husband of the patient. June 1867. The same month Mrs. Eleanor A. died. I stared again at the image on my screen, at the man and woman holding their smaller photograph, and realized something. The woman was not the wife of the man beside her, she was the patient. The man's expression, once neutral, now seemed almost triumphant, as if confirming an experiment's success. And the inner family? Perhaps hers. Perhaps the life she could no longer touch. The figure behind them might have been what she claimed to see, the late husband, Alcott dismissed as delusion. Only it had been recorded. At that point, rational explanation began to fray. I should have stopped my research. I should have written my report and archived the image like any other artifact. But each night, I found myself drawn back to it, staring into that nested composition, the living holding the dead, the seen containing the unseen. And sometimes, the longer I watched, the more I felt as if the outer couple's eyes, especially hers, shifted toward me. It wasn't movement, not exactly, more like an awareness. One evening, I stayed late in the lab, comparing spectral scans of the plate's silver surface. The room was dim except for the monitor's glow. Outside, snow fell against the window. The air smelled faintly of ozone from the scanning equipment. When the analysis completed, I leaned forward to inspect the overlay. The software detected microabrasions, tiny etchings invisible to the naked eye, along the brass border of the plate. I adjusted the contrast until the lines formed legible words. They were scratched faintly in a trembling hand. It spoke from behind the frame. I shut down the computer, locked the plate away, and told myself I was finished. But sleep offered no reprieve. I began dreaming of the darkroom, of the faint click of the camera shutter opening and closing, though I was the one being photographed. Each time I woke, the sound lingered, a metallic whisper fading into silence. The next morning, I found a new email in my inbox. It was from Mrs. Talbot in Surrey. She had continued checking their records and found something you might find relevant. Attached was a scanned obituary dated June 1867. Dr. Henry Alcott, noted photographic experimenter and physician, died suddenly at his residence following an accidental exposure to mercury vapors. His patient, Mrs. Eleanor A. had passed earlier that week. Both interred at Brookhaven Cemetery. I almost deleted it. But in the faint background of the scanned paper near the fold was an image, an advertisement for H. Alcott and Company, photographic studio. Its logo showed two hands holding a small framed picture, exactly like the Daguerreotype. That night, I retrieved the plate from the vault one final time. I told myself I needed closure, that I was documenting it for completeness. But even as I said the words aloud, they sounded like lies. I set up the lab's magnifier and placed the Daguerreotype beneath the light. The silver surface caught my reflection, my own face superimposed over theirs. I felt foolishly compelled to whisper, "What do you want from me?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then, in the smaller inner photograph, something seemed to shift. Not visibly, not like movement, but a sense of pressure, of awareness, stirring behind the emulsion. I leaned closer until my breath fogged the glass. The faintest impression appeared, new, impossible. Another figure had joined the inner group, smaller, blurred, standing behind the man with the sideburns, behind me. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, the image appeared behind my eyelids, nested frames within frames, each one breathing faintly like a lung made of glass. By morning, I was no longer certain what I had actually seen. The rational part of my mind kept insisting that I'd misinterpreted the light. Yet another part, a quieter, older instinct, knew I hadn't. I returned to the lab early, long before the technicians arrived. The building was silent except for the low hum of the security lights. When I opened the vault, the air inside was unnaturally cold, as if something had been exhaling there all night. The Daguerreotype lay exactly where I'd left it, but the thin fog on its glass, which usually came from temperature change, formed distinct streaks, as though brushed by fingertips from the inside. I told myself it was condensation, wiped it clean, and set it beneath the microscope. The inner photograph was still altered. The new figure, the one that shouldn't exist, was now perfectly clear. It was me. Not perfectly rendered, not in detail, but enough. The outline of my shoulders, the turn of my head, even the faint reflection of my glasses. My image had been absorbed into a plate of silver sealed for over 150 years. I stepped back too quickly, my chair scraping the floor. My heart hammered so hard, I could hear it echo off the lab walls. For the first time in my life, I felt an old superstition claw to the surface, an idea I'd mocked in my lectures. That early photography wasn't merely mechanical, but metaphysical. That every exposure was a bargain. That afternoon, I met with Dr. Amira Patel, a colleague in material preservation. She was brilliant, unflappable, and believed in chemistry more than ghosts. I showed her the daguerreotype without mentioning the anomaly, asking her to analyze the inner image. She leaned in, adjusted her glasses, and frowned. "Strange," she said. "There's a third figure here, isn't there? It looks modern." The word modern felt like a blade sliding between my ribs. She looked up at me, confused. "What am I seeing?" I lied. "Artifacting. Possibly a digital echo from scanning." She hesitated, then nodded. "Maybe. The plate chemistry is unusually reactive. I'll run a test." I left the lab before she could ask more questions. That evening, Amira called me at home. Her voice was smaller than usual. "I don't know what you've brought me," she said, "but there's something wrong with it." "What do you mean?" "When I measured the exposure bands under ultraviolet, the plate reacted. The silver brightened. Only for a second, but enough that the sensors picked it up." "That's impossible," I said. "I thought so too." A pause. "I'm not touching it again." I didn't blame her, because by then, I'd begun to hear things in the photograph. When the lab was quiet, when the hum of machines dulled into stillness, the daguerreotype emitted the faintest sound, not static, more like breath against glass. Sometimes it almost formed syllables, as though words were pressing through the metal. I recorded hours of the noise, trying to isolate the pattern. The waveform repeated every 72 seconds, rising and falling like a tide. I slowed it down, layered filters, amplified the faintest frequencies. At last, one phrase emerged: hoarse, strained, female. "Let me go." I shut off the computer so violently that the monitor cracked. Days blurred. I lectured half-heartedly, filed reports I didn't remember writing. Every spare moment, I returned to the image. It felt less like research and more like confession. I began to wonder if the daguerreotype had found me, rather than the reverse. At night, I caught reflections where they shouldn't be. Windows flickering with light though my room was dark, shadows bending slightly as I walked past. The voice on the recording sometimes changed tone, almost conversational, as if listening. Once I caught my reflection smiling a moment after my own face had gone still. By the end of the week, Amira resigned from the project. She wouldn't return my messages. Her assistant, a nervous doctoral student, delivered the test results. The report was brief and strange. Silver iodide residues unusually active. Plate appears to absorb low-frequency light. Chemical structure still mutable. Possible biological contamination. Biological contamination. In a plate, sealed since 1867. I searched Alcott's remaining letters again. One page, torn and water-stained, contained a note in his hand. "The spirit adheres to light as the body does to air. To fix the image is to imprison it." I thought of Eleanor, the patient who claimed her husband spoke from the silver. What if she hadn't been delusional? What if Alcott's so-called experiment had succeeded, had captured more than an image? And what if the spirit within the plate wasn't hers at all? I became obsessed with the inner photograph, the one the couple displayed. The longer I studied it, the more it seemed to change. At first, the shadow behind the family had only form. Now it had depth, a texture like smoke curling upward. The eyes within that smoke glinted, faint but unmistakable. They seemed to look past the family and directly into the camera, directly at me. I began noticing a pattern. Each time I magnified the image, small details shifted. Curtains that hung differently. the angle of a child's hand. On the 10th enlargement, one of the children's heads turned slightly toward the figure behind them, and on the 11th, the child's mouth was open, as if speaking. I scrolled through each version rapidly, frame by frame, and saw motion. The inner photograph was moving. The historian in me recoiled, but the part of me that had stopped sleeping leaned closer. If the plate could react, could evolve, then perhaps it wasn't a photograph anymore. Perhaps it was a window. The university requested an interim presentation for the Lyle collection. I arrived late, carrying the daguerreotype in a protective case that felt heavier than it should have. The audience was small: faculty, donors, students. I began my lecture automatically, tracing the history of early photography, the chemistry of silver iodide, the significance of the Alcott experiments. When I reached the final slide, the scanned image, I felt the room change. The lights dimmed slightly, though no one had touched the controls. On the projector screen, the photograph filled the wall. The couple stared down at us, eternal and unsmiling. The smaller image between them glowed faintly, like the reflection of a candle seen through water. Someone in the back gasped, "What's that behind them?" A student whispered. I turned to look. In the projected image, the shadow had grown. Its outline stretched up the wall, crossing the ornate frame. The face within the darkness was no longer faint. It was distinct, human, and horribly familiar. It was mine. The projector flickered violently. The lights went out. When they came back, the screen was blank, and the daguerreotype case had cracked open on the table. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the head of the department cleared his throat and suggested we adjourn. That night, I received an email from the IT department. "Professor, we tried to recover your presentation file, but it's corrupted. Every copy contains the same image, a blank silver surface with a faint reflection of a man. The file metadata lists its creation date as June 1867. After that, I stopped going to campus. Officially, I was on sabbatical. Unofficially, I was unraveling. I kept the daguerreotype at home, despite every instinct telling me to destroy it. I couldn't bring myself to. Each time I thought of smashing the glass, a pressure filled the room, like air thickening before a storm. I began recording myself sleeping. The first 2 nights showed nothing. On the third, at 2:47 a.m., the video froze for 6 seconds, then resumed. When I reviewed the frame, my bed was empty. I was standing beside the desk, holding the daguerreotype, my eyes open and unfocused. Behind me, the curtains were moving. A week later, campus security called. The lab where Amira had worked suffered an electrical fire. Small, contained. No injuries, but several artifacts were damaged. When I arrived, the air smelled of burned paper and ozone. Among the debris was a melted brass frame. The inventory listed it as duplicate plate, unidentified subject, but it wasn't a duplicate. It was another version of the same photograph. The couple, the inner family, the shadow, except this one was missing the inner image entirely. Only the couple remained, their hands gripping empty air where the smaller photograph should have been. They were no longer looking down, they were looking forward. The final entry in Dr. Alcott's notes haunted me. If the subject resists separation, the exposure must be repeated until all light is consumed. Beware the mirror effect. The observer completes the circuit. I didn't understand it then. I do now. On the last night I handled the daguerreotype. I set it on my desk beside the surviving ledger. I turned off the lights, leaving only the glow of my monitor. The silver surface reflected the room faintly, like a shallow pool. My own face hovered beside the man's, our eyes almost aligned. I whispered, "What are you?" And from somewhere inside the glass, a whisper answered. Not from speakers, not from air, but from within the metal itself. "We are what remains when the light forgets." The sound reverberated through the room. My monitor blinked, showing not my desktop, but a live image feed, grainy, monochrome. The view was from behind my shoulder, though no camera was there. I watched my own figure lean closer to the screen, mirroring the pose of the man in the photograph. The voice spoke again, softer. "Hold still." And then the light flared white. When I woke, dawn was bleeding through the curtains. The daguerreotype lay face down, warm to the touch. My reflection in the glass beside it was different, fainter, slightly out of sync when I moved. I tried scanning the image again. This time, the software refused to process it, declaring no subject detected. Yet when I tilted the plate under the light, there was clearly someone new standing between the couple, half-formed, indistinct. But there, a figure holding a book, my notes, visible through the blur. That was 3 months ago. The university has since sealed the artifact in a controlled vault, citing radiation anomalies. They no longer contact me directly. All correspondence comes through legal channels. They've denied my requests to see it again. But sometimes, late at night, I receive emails with no sender, attachments that contain a single image, the couple, the inner family, the dark figure behind them. And each time, the image is closer, sharper, until the last one I opened last week. In that photograph, there was no couple, no inner frame, no shadow, only my face, staring back, lit by a faint silver light. Now I keep the curtains closed, not because I'm afraid of what's outside, but because when the light hits the glass in just the right way, I can almost see them behind it, waiting patiently, framed forever in their small metallic world. They don't blink, and neither anymore do I.